Well, it was delightful, of course, but if I could imagine an ideal reader, I would have imagined someone just like Barack Obama, absent the title of president, because he's so smart and he's empathetic and he's kind and he's funny and he's surrounded by women, so he's a feminist. And he's also an incredible writer himself. You know, he's a literary stylist of the highest degree, and there's no compliment that's nicer for a writer than if another writer likes your work. So just even as a human being, to have him respond to my book was really astonishing. That he took that time for himself to actually read fiction, which is, you know, food for the soul, not necessarily just for the brain. It was pretty amazing to hear. Oh God, I can't come up with these things at the moment. Again, so I love it when other writers like my work, and I guess the thing that I am most both embarrassed and pleased by is if they say that they wish that they had written the book themselves. I love that, and I feel very happy about that. So I wanted to find a form that could show time passing relatively quickly, but also at the same time show aspects of Lotto's life that he wasn't necessarily thinking that he was revealing to himself through his creative work. Because it's true that whatever you write sort of reflects yourself to the world at large. And so I wanted him I wanted it to do multiple things at once, which is talk about the forward progression of his life in time, but also at the same time sort of talk about the resonances of other events that happened, even things that he wasn't quite aware that had happened to him and to Mathilde. It's absolutely the truth. You know, nothing that I write is necessarily autobiographical, but everything is relatively personal. And if it's not personal, the reader can tell that there's no stake in the book. I mean, the writer has to actually look into her own darkest corners in order to show the reader something truthful, I believe. So all of my books are personal. This one in particular is very personal. My previous book, Arcadia, was also very personal. But I have yet to write an autobiographical anything, story or novel. I don't think it's possible to know another person. And Rilke has an amazing quote about this, about if you accept the distance that there is between people, that's when true intimacy actually begins. I mean, that's when you can stand within the world and understand who you are in relation to the rest of the world. And I think that that's absolutely the case. I think that you can be deeply intimate with someone without knowing everything about them, and that essential autonomous mystery is really important, and recognizing it in another person is really important. I don't think all women have anger, but I think all people have some sort of anger, right? It's not just a feminine trait. I think Mathilde's anger comes from her inability to express her anger. So it just sort of builds under this thin scrim of elegance. But it's there and it's sort of pulsing in her. And only she really sees it all day long. But even she, I don't think, recognizes how deep her anger runs or why it is what it is, because she's quite a survivor. So I think that rage, female rage in particular, can be exacerbated by the society in which we live, in that, particularly in the south of America where I live, a woman is not expected to have access to her rage in a public way. So if a woman bursts out furiously, she is called all sorts of names, right? It just societal pressure exists against that sort of outburst. It's much easier for a man to access his rage in a public way. And so if you are constantly told you're not allowed to rage, or allowed to feel your anger, you suppress it, and you suppress it, and you suppress it. And what was interesting in me was trying to look at the literary predecessors of female rage on the page, right? So all the way back to the Greeks, but Dido, Medea, Antigone even, and going up through times that Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina. And my view of it is that furious women in the past, as literary models, always killed themselves, right? Because every single one of those women did. Yes, they were written by men, and, but it's also this very harmful turning of rage into a weapon against oneself. And I resist that very, very deeply, because I don't think that's necessarily the only model of female rage that's in the world. Yes, it exists, but I think one can go outward with the rage too, and that might be actually much healthier. So I was interested in looking at female anger as an explosive thing, as opposed to an implosive thing. No, because at the time that I finally got through my hundreds of drafts until I sat down to actually work on the line by line, I knew Lotto. I mean, I knew his immense flaws as a human being, and I think that it's no harder to write from the opposite sex, particularly because we're all human beings, and recognizing the pressures that exist outside of a human being is just as important as recognizing those that exist inside the person. So it wasn't hard for me at that point, and in my previous books too, I write from a lot of male perspectives too. It's just different, right? It's not harder or less hard. They're just human beings, so they're all different.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a husband who has some of Lotto's characteristics, but also some of Lotto's characteristics are my own. I would not be married to a man like Lotto, nor would I ever find him all that attractive, because he is a big player, and he is a massive narcissist, and he does not have intellectual curiosity into Mathilde's interior life. So yeah, it wouldn't even happen ever. Because someone would die, and that someone would be him. So no, the experience of writing this in two separate halves came from the idea that I had for years that this was going to be two separate books that I wanted to publish at the same time, which never happened. And rightly so, I'm very glad, because I don't think you could have read Mathilde's part first. I think it had to be read in the sequence that it was. I love short stories. I love writing them, but it's a completely different art form, I think, from writing novels, because a novel you wake up to every day. It's like being married for 5 to 6 years to this amorphous thing that only slowly comes into shape. But everything that you do relates to the novel, right? Every book that you read has something in it that will go on to affect the book, or every weird wormhole on Wikipedia, something will come up and will go into the novel. But for me, at least, short stories, I try not to force them. I just sort of leave them in the back of my head for a long, long time until usually they rub up against something else that I've either read or experienced, and I've figured out the way to write them. And then they fall to the front of my mind. They obscure everything else. I can't even look at my novel until I finish this short story. So it's really different, the difference between a sprint and a marathon in a very real way. And most of the short stories I write, probably 9 out of 10 do not succeed. And so they just go back into the mental vault, and someday they'll come down again. The Iliad. You have to go back to the Iliad, because I read it in high school, and it was a far different experience than reading it as an adult. with a better understanding of sort of history and literature. It's the most magical, incredible, extraordinary, bloody book you've ever read. It's so exciting. It's so exciting to read. Another, oh gosh, I would read Mr. Bridge and Mrs. Bridge by Evan S. Connell. They're amazing, absolutely phenomenal. There's so many books to read. There's just too many. The Glass Essay by Anne Carson. She's my favorite writer, actually, just alive. She's this Canadian classicist who's also a poet, who also writes these slippery in-between things. Essays, meeting fiction, meeting poetry at the same time in a very strange way. And The Glass Essay is about a breakup, and it's about the Brontes. And it's just extraordinary. It's a long poem you can read in one sitting. It's really wonderful. I've read a few books that I'm supposed to review, but I have declined to review them, so I won't tell you about them. I'm reading books to give blurbs to, but I may decline to do that, so I can't tell you those either. So I use trips as a way to just get all my work done. Let me see. I'm about to start Paul Beatty's The Sellout, which is apparently an amazing book, but I haven't read it yet. I don't know. My oldest son, who's 7, is now reading The Hobbit, and it is one of the best books ever. I'm really enjoying reading it alongside of him. It's really, really fun. No, my favorite book of all time is George Eliot's Middlemarch. It's just this dense brick of a novel from, Victorian England. But George Eliot has the most empathetic wisdom of almost any writer ever, and all I want to do is spend time in her brain. And Middlemarch is so insightful about human nature, and you just love all the characters. I mean, I don't read a book in order to like the characters, and I don't like all the characters, but I love them. They feel like family at this point. I have gotten a lot of emails from people who have told me that they couldn't like my book because they couldn't like the characters. And I think that's hilarious, because that is such a strange way to read a book, I think, to try to see likability, to try to see yourself in a character when fiction exists in order to show you things that you don't already know. It's not supposed to be a mirror necessarily, or else it's not supposed to be a faithful mirror. It's supposed to play on what you already see and to maybe show you something deeper. So I think it's really hilarious when people tell me this. I laugh and then click delete, because someone who will approach a book in terms of liking the characters is not my ideal reader. It has to be someone who's interested in human nature, and humans are not always nice. I love Grace Paley. I think her voice just infects you. And she's so economical. She can do in a story of 3 pages what nobody can do in a whole novel. I mean, she's so great. So her collected stories is the story collection that I return to again and again. I think there has to be a mixture of powers, right? It has to be cerebral, but it also has to be of the heart, and it has to be visceral at the same time too. So I think that it cannot just be intellectual, right? A book that's intellectual won't move me at all. A book that's only sentimental, only of the heart, will never move me either. And a book that's mostly gross, right? Or visceral. Like I'm thinking of wetlands. I don't care, right? Like it's not a book that I care about. But when all of those sensibilities are mixed together, that's when it's a book that'll stay in my mind for a very long time.